Welcome to another Austin Software Co-operative Meetup. This is our October 2021 meeting. We're doing a book review on Cybernetic Revolutionaries by Eden Medina. And Jose Montoya is going to lead us today. Are you ready?
Yep.
All right.
So, hey guys, for those of you who don't know me, like Taylor said, my name is Jose Montoya. I am a software architect specializing in enterprise integration applications. I work for a consulting company based out of West Virginia. I've been interested in, worker co-ops for a very short minute. So that's what led me to find Bulk and, Taylor, Watson, and Lucina. So this is about, I think, my third book review. This one, Cybernetic Revolutionaries, was mentioned in the last book that we reviewed, which was I forget the name.
People's Republic of Walmart.
That's right. And so, it was very interesting to me being Latin American, and so, Watson and Taylor suggested I let the review for this one. So here we are. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So this is my first book review that I do. And so I sort of just took notes as I was reading the chapters of what I thought were the main points or what stood out to me. So some of these thoughts might be a little, not very fluid from one to the other. So you'll forgive me for that, or, feel free to jump in and, fill in the blanks as we go. So the first chapter, I think, is more of an introductory treatment on, cybernetics and how they may relate to socialism and some of the different concepts specific to the protagonists. I guess in this case, one being Stafford Beer, the other being, the Chilean effort to introduce socialism to the country. So first, cybernetics is described by Eden Medina here as the science of communication and control. I was first introduced to this concept by Jeff Susna, which references a lot of the same people that are referenced in the book. I forget the name of the main person that's I think from the US. I think Wiener is his last name, and then Stafford Beer being another person of one of the main influencers or main people that drove this science. And so I think the main difference that it brings when you compare it to I suppose Taylorism or traditional ways of controlling enterprises or organizations in general is directed control in a hierarchical fashion versus homeostasis, which is described to be as, when you have independent, pieces of an organism and they all sort of work together without, a central direction, they try to basically preserve their viability or their, purpose for being all of their own. They sort of self-organize to perform their objective. And so that's kind of, what cybernetics at least means to me, at least the way that I've understood it. And so this is the science of studying, how or why that is. Specifically, Stafford Beer, who's an English, British gentleman, he was interested in the application of that into management. And so Eden Medina describes it as the application to effective organization. I think the way that this relates to Chilean's effort of socialism is because Stafford Beer's viable system model has a lot of emphasis on the individual's freedom and creativity being the main drivers of the day-to-day changes or the day-to-day operations. I think this aligns very well with Allende's and their government's understanding of socialism, which obviously I'm no expert on, but as I understand it, is usually misunderstood to be basically the nationalization or centralization of every enterprise for the good of the people versus having a strong, a strong effort of making sure that there's a lot of worker participation in these decisions. So it's sort of, driven from the bottom up instead of from the top down. And so I think that, understanding of socialism aligned very well with Stafford Beer's understanding of cybernetics and the way that the viable system model worked, and the way that he developed it. And then the other thing that was interesting to me was Fabianism, as I understand it, is the achievement or the driving of socialism through evolution or to parliamentarism instead of through like armed revolution. And so that's what Chile through Allende was able to achieve, being, as I understand it, the one or one of the only or one of the first democratically elected governments, to drive socialism. So these are the main points that I took out of the first chapter and kind of how they all relate together. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in here or agrees or disagrees with these things.
All makes sense to me.
Yeah, I would just add that you were right when you said the first, because now we have the Bolivarian Revolution in Bolivia and Peru. I mean, this stuff is happening all over Latin America now.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so let's move on to the next chapter, please. Okay, so how does Stafford Beer come into play in the Chilean effort for socialism? Is that so Fernando Flores was, I believe, a student in the university when he was introduced to the topics of cybernetics, and he had read some of Stafford Beer's books or some of his publications, and he thought that when the government won the elections and he was, I think, given some lower position in the government, he thought that he could use some of the viable system model or some of Stafford Beer's teachings in a way that could help the government drive production up, in the context of the nationalization process. So he contacted Beer, and Beer was, very willing to help, because he thought this was a good, as I understand that this was a good way for him to sort of put a lot of his ideas in to the test, or even experiment and drive forward the way that he was thinking about cybernetics and management. So that's what interested him. I think was a lot of the motivation for him to help the government. So this was in the context of, again, nationalizing a lot of the industries that drove Chile and recovering from the Great Depression. There was a lot of sentiment in the country of using computers to do a lot of this stuff because of efforts that the previous administration had done. As I understand it, they did do a lot of I don't know if nationalization, but they did a lot of socialized efforts, and so through that they had bought a lot of IBM mainframe computers that were they were putting to work to that effort. And so by the election of Allende, they just wanted to sort of accelerate that process, or maybe in a more radicalized way. So I put it here, nationalization of industries run by young people, because I think this is a theme that I see a lot every time that I read a little bit about revolutions around the world. In Cuba, I think I read at some point the plans after the revolution were very superficial, and so after the revolution had won, they ended up having to, at that point, figure out what they were going to do with the country, and ends up being that a lot of young people that don't have a lot of experience doing these things are the ones put in charge. I saw the same in the revolution in Nicaragua in the late 70s and 80s, where we had really young people running the country, basically doing things that they really had no experience doing. And so it was the same here. I think with Fernando Flores being one of the main examples of that. I think by the end of the book, he is like the Secretary of Finance, or some really high position, while he's like in his mid-20s, I think. So that brings up a whole sort of problems about how they do those things. Let's see. Okay, so they wanted to address the problems with just replacing bosses with government-appointed people who would basically end up doing the same functions and perhaps, continuing the same sort of class dynamics between them. And so they wanted to make sure that they were addressing those things. Then I'm calling out here the nationalization of foreign-owned banks, because I think this is definitely a big, motivation for the U.S. blockade. Not only were they nationalizing, companies that were doing mining or electricity or all these things, but I think once you go after the banks, you're really inviting a lot of, intervention from the United States, and so that's what ended up happening. And this chapter calls out a lot of the difference between the sort of work that Safford and Fernando Flores were doing in Chile versus the efforts in the United States and the Soviet Union. So I think Medina drives the point that a lot of the work in the United States was driven by the military. So it was all very, applied to those, those applications or whatever the use cases were for the military. And in the Soviet Union, even though it was also a socialist project, it was very top down, right? So she calls out a lot of, and I think we read a little bit about this in the Republic of Walmart too, where, the people that were in charge of reporting the data, they were discouraged from reporting accurately because they were perceived as, being enemies of the revolution. And so that top-down approach was, contrasted to the emphasis that Stafford Beer put in the design itself about making it from the bottom up, making sure that there was a lot of a room for worker participation, even though in the end we see that that wasn't the case. And then Flores going all in, basically, trying to pitch this project to the highest places of the national economy as he could, making the pitch to, even the president himself at the end. So yeah, this is, I think, what I took from the chapter. What do you guys think?
A good review.
What's that?
Yeah, this is a really good review. The foreign-owned banks, yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. The Americans don't like it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear this from this side. I've read about it from the American side, still hostile to the American side, but from American viewpoint of the Chicago boys and all the people that they try to send over to try to do all types of, harassing everyone over there. So interesting to hear it from this side.
Yeah, I think Eden calls out Bank of America and another, I don't know if it was JP Morgan or another one of the bigger banks. So I think that was definitely a big motivation for the later intervention.
One other thing I found that I mean, from Beer's point of view, this was and that's brought up in the book too, that this was an incredible opportunity for somebody with, like, he even says that he had an orgasm when he got that invitation from Chile, because here's somebody who's dreaming on a big scale of ideas, and you never get the chance to try that out at a countrywide level, and here he does get that chance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as a the book goes on and you see the way that this was sort of his dream, and then he gets less and less motivated by money to keep working on it, because it ends up being, I think, sort of his main contribution, at least in his eyes, I think, to the science of cybernetics and management, I think. Okay, so we move on to the next one. Okay, so as you can see, I didn't really, jot down too many points about this particular chapter. I think it was just sort of a very technical description of the state of Chile at that time and what they had at hand. So because of the US blockade, they sort of were very limited in what they could use to build this network to connect, all the different enterprises across the country, and this viable system model of, communication and decentralized control. And so basically they had to be very resourceful, and they decided to use these telexes machines that they didn't even really have enough at the time that they made this decision. They later found out that there were some that were bought by the previous government, and they were able to acquire and basically deploy across the country, or at least through the enterprises that were nationalized. Centralization because of a single mainframe, I think Eden Medina makes the point later on that the project was criticized because its implementation was very centralized. And I think it was worth mentioning that that was because that was the only way they were able to implement the processing of the data, because they only had a single mainframe. By default, the system was going to be sort of centralized. So it was not part of the design of having it that way. It was just the reality of what they had at hand that made them sort of send all the information to the central mainframe for processing, even if it was supposed to go back down to the enterprises or to the, I suppose, the distributed operations rooms. But so, yeah, I think that was sort of a unfair criticism based on what they had to do. The temporary suite versus the permanent suite is something that I didn't really quite understand exactly the difference between the two, or why it had to be done this way. Maybe someone can help me fill in the blanks here a little bit. My understanding is that so in order to make any usefulness out of the data that they would be collecting, they had to contract a firm from England to basically process this data. They were not able to pay them what they required in order to do this, so they sort of decided to do this halfway approach, that the firm was going to do a temporary suite, sort of a prototype, as I understood it, of the functionality, and teach the Chilean engineers on how to build the permanent or the fully implemented model. I didn't really understand the technical differences, or why it couldn't have been a way that why it couldn't have been built in a way that they could have just taken the prototype and built off of that, because they were building it in parallel. So some of that didn't entirely make sense to me. But something that was interesting to me was the emphasis that Beer put in modeling the behavior instead of representing the entire economy. And so I think this is something that takes into consideration the law of requisite variety, as it was described in the book, and also something that the previous book that we read talked about, the Republic of Walmart, where instead of trying to model entire really complex system of systems, you just try to approximate as most as you can to what is useful. And so I think the idea here was, instead of modeling in the enterprise fully, modeling each independent part within the enterprise, you just sort of block box the enterprise into the inputs and outputs that you can, and then from there you decide which of the inputs are the main factors in driving the outcomes that you want out of the outputs, and then you sort of amplify those in order to drive the production of the economy, right? So that's modeling the behavior versus sort of a accurate representation of the economy, and using Dynamo as a language to do this in the software that was delivered. So I'm guessing some of you guys have probably understood some of these things better than me. So if you guys have anything to add to that.
Nothing to add. You did a great job. I'm grappling with the same stuff. It's fascinating because it seems like this is kind of how natural systems work. That's what I'm hooked on this. I plan on continuing to explore it, because the whole idea that how do you manage this, exponential growth of complexity is you have to use heuristics, and it seems like even maybe genetically that's how nature works.
Yeah, cybernetics, I believe, is like kind of the origin of modern neural network and that kind of early AI stuff. I have a friend who is doing his PhD in complex systems, and his stuff is like different. I don't exactly know, or I don't really understand it, but it's supposed to originate from cybernetic stuff, and it's like machine learning-esque, data science-y.
He made a couple references to systems theory. I think that had an influence by cybernetic. Forgetting the guy that made the original neural net. Ends of the M is his name, but I'm not so sure he knew. Like, probably familiar with cybernetics, but I'm not so sure he's influenced.
I actually didn't do the reading, but I knew about Stafford Beers from a podcast called the Cybernetic Marxists General Intellect Unit. And it's a podcast about cybernetics and stuff. And the episode that I remember where they talked most about Beers was where they reviewed like a book of his poetry, which is kind of interesting. He's an artist and stuff. He's like a interesting guy. He's has a book of poetry. Anyway, and it's like thematically relevant to his work in cybernetics, which is cool.
Yeah, I think he got weird with it towards the end.
I mean, if you're gonna have that kind of beard, work in cybernetics, you gotta get weird with it, probably.
I think so. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I think here we're getting into 1972, maybe 1973 already, where I think this temporary suite of data processing is already in place, and the Chilean team is sort of being mentored by the British team on how to do the implementation. So Medina talks a lot about the technology transfer, and that it's not just about the artifacts or the things that are transferred from one country to the other. For example, it talks about how the British team found, very little process that they could recognize in the Chilean software development versus their own processes, such as documentation and testing and some other, activities. And so she makes the point of, it's not just artifacts, but the people, culture, patterns, and the expertise that were transferred, during this experiment or this project. So the Chilean expertise separating from the British expectation, she makes the point of, a lot of the modeling that the main architect, I forget his name, was doing was based on their understanding of the British economy or some of the expectations about the data that was being collected by the government that would be made available to the data processing. And so it started to diverge, to separate from what the Chileans were able to do and what they had to basically do in the software to deal with it. Also, as the economy is starting to go through more interventions and more internal destabilization, they realize that one of their main obstacles is not really just nationalizing and optimizing their enterprises for elevating production, but the lack of external investments because of the US blockade. And again, because they don't have the necessary historical data, even though as I understand it, they didn't really need like years worth of data, but they were just not collecting enough data to feed the model that was being created. And then there was I think half of the chapter was about design, right? About basically how
they were forced, or the Chilean government was driven to drive the sign from internal, from the own Chileans, right? So there was, she talks about a design team being formed basically as they went from different, majors in the college from, I forget exactly which colleges, but basically the program existed, but they had no teacher, had no curriculum. So the students themselves starting to compose what they wanted to learn and who would be teaching it. They talk a little bit about the Chilean, academics that ended up being very influential in cybernetics. I think Maturana was one of the names that I keep reading about, even outside of this book. He was a Chilean professor, I believe. And so a lot of the design for Cybersyn and for other things in the socialism project were driven by, Chilean designers. I think there was like a low cost record player and a few other things that, was embedding some of the same values, socialist values that the project wanted to embed into Cybersyn. They were also seeing that, in every other part of the effort that was being driven by designers. I think one of the challenges that I got from this chapter was that as the project was starting to get a little bit of popularity, or at least a little bit more of participation, you were getting people from other factions of government or other, parties that saw the project as more of a technological neutral project rather than the, politically motivated project that it was supposed to be. And so we were getting, a lot of technocrats, which I understand to be these, sort of, how to put it? So people that saw themselves above the workers, or they were just, a higher class of people that were, they were good with technology. So they would drive these projects without involving the workers, which was, attempted to be the whole purpose of the project. And the implementation of the project itself was supposed to drive worker participation, but it was just not happening. And that they couldn't do class dynamics overnight. And I think that sort of resonates with worker co-ops in a bit as well, because people can join co-ops, but I've heard from different sources that it takes a year or two even for workers to realize the different dynamics that you have when you're a co-owner of an enterprise versus just being directed on what to do. And so I think these are some of the things that the project was having problems with. And then they realized that they needed to repoliticize the project to bring the motivation to be central to the project again. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's something we need to bring forward, the technocrats and the class dynamics. We need to make sure that, in whatever we do now, that our workers, whoever it is, that, well, in my opinion, I think technology, we should kind of look at ourselves as artisans, as more as like craftsmen, or something along those lines, so that we can avoid the class dynamics. But that's me.
Yeah, I honestly didn't get beyond this section in the book. I didn't have time, but you're doing a great presentation, Jose.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Again, this is my first review, but I try to jot down as many central points as at least as I consider them. I agree with Watson on the artisan way that I view software. I think those are views that were reinforced by reading Eric Evans and what's this guy's name? The guy that wrote the Mythical Man Month, Frederick Brooks. He talks about good designers, and software being entirely a creative process, that the hard part of software is actually, the abstract, not the actual implementation. So I I don't want to say that I see myself as an artist, but closer to like an abstract form than, a very mathematical way of solving problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is, I think, definitely, okay, this is October 1973. So a couple of years into the project. We have the October strike, which is precipitated by, again, the US blockade, and sort of, the more affluent people in the country driving worker strikes or enterprise firm strikes across the country. And I think what we see here is, because firms are starting to shut down, and exacerbated by low production with higher consumption, because I think there was some redistribution of wealth. People had more buying power, but we were producing even less than before. So there was, we get to the strike, and we're met with this emergency. And I think this, at least the way that I see this is, in a critical environment, in a critical context or situation, organisms, sort of drive towards centralization. So I don't know if it was in this book or somewhere else that I read, when you're in a state of panic or action, your brain, shoots you with adrenaline, and then you have, in some situations it slows down your breathing, or fastens your breathing depending on the situation. And so it drives an organism through a more centralized way of operating in order to survive the situation. And this is what happened, I think, in the economy, where a lot of these firms decided to where actually they repurposed the telex network for communication, and instead of being very sort of coordinating everything locally, they were sending all the information up to the central office, where the government could help them make decisions. But at the same time, there was some horizontal communication where they were able to organize this to what routes were not being held by the opposition, what trucks were still operating. I failed to mention, because the strike was a strike by the truck owners or the truck company, so there was they were not being able to move products across the country. So I think they were bypassing some of these sort of lower level centralized organizations, like I think unions or some of their sort of organization, and communicating directly with higher levels of the government, but still at some level having some horizontal organization, just very destructured, sort of ad hoc as they needed to, and sort of responding in the time of crisis. At the same time, I think when this happens, they recover. They were able to withstand the strike because of the network that was put in place by the project. They can't pay Beer his usual fees, and then he's presented basically with the decision of, okay, so he's lived an affluent lifestyle. He has wife and kids that are used to a particular standard of living, and now he cannot demand the same wages from the Chile government. And he decides, or he's has this struggle with what is valuable to him, what he wants to do with his life. I think I'm sure that's something that all of us can empathize with. And so he goes through this personality crisis, I guess. Okay, so when he decides to lower his fees, and I think he decides to do some side work in order to still provide for his family, he comes back sort of doubling down, reinvigorated, decides to that in order to make the project successful, that they have to include not only production but also consumption and distribution of products, I guess, and to make sure that the direct worker participation is something that is emphasized, and there is less bureaucratic things in the middle, like I think it was union specifically, but that he saw just organically happen when the strike, occurred. I think Medina makes also the point of technology being viewed as a tool for automation and worker displacement versus in Project Cybersyn, where it was viewed as instrumental to empower the workers to help them make their own decisions about their firms and what they should do and where they should take those activities. And then again, the problem of basically government officials just being new bosses is just workers just being new administrators or new bosses, even if they're coming from the same firm, just establishing themselves in old class dynamics. And then here, I think Flores versus Stafford wants is at this point, Flores is in a much higher position in the government, and he starts sort of losing faith in cybernetics as a solution for the production problem, whereas Stafford sort of wants to double down on that effort in order to make it successful. What do you guys think?
I was interested in the whole idea of embedding the values into the design and construction, which is, where you're saying they went down different paths after that. So Beer was wanting to double down on that side.
Yeah, I think
we could use more of that. We talk about as far as user experience and stuff, thinking about those things up front, but if you want to have software that's making a larger change, I think you got to think about these type of things, the values.
Yeah, I think they call out maybe this chapter or the next one that, so the idea was that individual firms, if there was a problem, it would be automatically communicated to the higher level, but the higher level was supposed to wait a certain amount of time before doing anything, and they had to let the firm sort of try to deal with it. And I think the problem that Medina emphasizes later is that because there was no sort of middle tier between the enterprise and the central government, because it was very flat like that, it was basically a few steps between the person receiving a stress signal and letting a higher person know instead of letting the enterprise themselves figure it out. And so even though I think they did try to design it in a way where there was a lot more autonomy, it just didn't play out that well because of technical constraints. Do we move on to the next slide? Okay, so I think this is definitely 1974, at least late 1973. The team had been reluctant to make the project public for a while, even though Stafford Beer thought it was a good idea to do so in order to help the people, sort of align with it and support it and understand it as a tool for driving the socialist project and, as a way of helping, the people, I suppose. But they make this, big plan of when they're going to announce it, what they're going to say about it. They're going to announce it, I think, in a British expo, and at the same time in Chile in some publication. But the announcement gets leaked, and some, I don't know if it was right wing, but some paper in England misrepresents it as, Soviet sort of centralized cybernetics that is totalitarian and oppressive, like some of those other governments. And so basically their whole plan goes wayside, and I don't think they ever really recover from the optics of how the project is being seen. There were a lot of, I think, probably fair technological criticisms. I think some person from the United States said that in order for them to do what they were claiming to do, they needed sort of an absurd amount of computing power. I think maybe from misunderstanding of, again, of modeling behavior instead of, an accurate representation of the economy. But basically, the whole project was sold as this totalitarian, centralized Big Brother type of thing. And I think the point of this Cold War framing is driven a lot by Medina, that basically Chile, even though they were independent of what the US and the Soviet Union were doing, they could not escape framing anything about socialism and computer control from this totalitarian, centralized system, even though the aim and the motivation was entirely different from the fundamental of the project itself. At the end, I think by this point, Fernando Flores is, I think that, Secretary of Finance, or this, the highest position that he ends up having. And by this point, there's, I think Raúl Espejo is the one driving the project. He starts complaining that, there's more people in the project that don't understand the political motivation, that think it's a neutral project. And basically the government is not really helping them much with, forcing or at least encouraging adoption from the enterprise that they maybe need at the moment. Or I think they did have some enterprise communicating this data with them, but a lot of the decisions that the country was making, they didn't even know about this project. And that was, in his thought, because of lack of political support. At this point, I think Beer is starting to contemplate why that is. And I think he learns about autopieces from Maturana, which is this other Chilean academic. I think he's the one that pioneers the theme of the cybernetics of cybernetics, or meta cybernetics, or higher order cybernetics, however you want to put it. And that basically he understands autopieces as being, the motivation to self-reproduce, or to, basically self-reproduce in order to exist, right? And so he sees bureaucracy as always self-reproducing, and there's really no way to really get away from it without, fundamental or revolutionary change. And he makes the observation, which I thought was pretty impactful, that if the highest recursion of the planet was capitalist, basically the collection of nations and economic systems, that it was impossible for a lower recursion, in this case, Chile's socialist project, to succeed, again, in that context of the world being capitalist. So that's pretty doom and gloom, but I think it might be accurate to some degree. And in my opinion, it just means that no one, isolated project will succeed without other nations sort of trying to achieve the same in a cooperative way. And then around this time, late in 1974, I think, is the second strike, and shortly thereafter, the military coup. I think at this point, Beer makes it out of the country, and basically everyone else gets jailed. The president is obviously, he's not shot. He commits suicide in the palace before, they storm the presidential palace. And again, everyone else is jailed. So I think these are the main points of the last chapter. There was a following conclusion, which I didn't, summarize for the, because it's a conclusion on its own. Don't want to summarize the summary. And then a bit later, a little bit of, where are they now type of summary, about everyone that was important to the project. So this kind of concludes my review. So if you guys want to, jump into an open discussion, or if you have anything to add, let's get into that.
Yeah, this last portion, I'm kind of vested in it, because we need to figure out how can you have these organic, even though we kind of look as it as it's a kind of a top down, or someone not reading the book might think of it as top down. We often refer to the systems as being organic at each level. How can we get it to where these types of organic systems respond to the environment beyond the local social, but these, I guess, international, adversarial powers? So, is there any way that we could make the different systems maybe more anonymous, or something like that, using technology, so that can be more resistant to these different attacks from the outside? And then also, I think, to somehow make these systems where people have more buy-in with the system that they're in, somehow making that, we had this saying, I guess, in Agile, make the work visible, so whoever's paying you can see. Even if you're paying down technological debt, they can kind of see what you're doing, so you're not just spinning your wheels. Well, maybe to the workers involved, to the different classes that are involved on System 1, System 2, make the incentives visible, so that you can kind of get them, make it to where they have more buy-in, and bringing it back to cooperatives where everyone is, like an owner, that kind of thing. Everyone's part of the decision-making process, all that stuff like that. That way of communicating the buy-in, maybe that would make it harder to, yes, it was said here that there were people going on strike against the, there were workers going on strike against the system. So there's that, and then those are two things, and then I'll just bring this one over here. Here's I was talking about the Chicago boys, the other side of the story. So this is United States, their plan against Chile. This is one of our lead economists, Milton Friedman. He was the one that created the Chicago Boys, and they, some other notable names, Heritage Foundation. But they were the ones that were in there on the economic side, causing havoc. And you can see, in the early 70s, they were in there, and then they brought about Pinochet afterward. So it doesn't really talk about Allende here, but who they're up against. I just figured I'd bring that out. There's lots of books on that, but yeah. So those are the things I'm wanting. I'm very interested in thinking about these systems and then trying to make them even more resistant to being hijacked from the inside. Okay, but that's it. Anyone else? Oh, I guess I did this little sketch note while I was going through, but we already went through everything. That Cold War portion is one that I think here in the United States, it would be, if we were to create something where people can kind of organize around cooperatives or unions or anything, it needs to be resistant to being, union busted or cooperative busted or what have you, because that type of resistance is going to happen. How do you share communication between the different system levels without misinformation, so on and so forth? we don't really read a lot about how these organic systems, social systems, get dismantled. How strategically, when the Eye of Sauron points at these, they get annihilated, right? The only ones we know of, well, the most popular ones we know of are very, very, very hostile to outside. There's then you have Scandinavian socialism, right? It's not that big of a threat. That's what we want, and we're it's not that big of a change. So, but something that would be radical, a sizable amount of the workforce being in cooperatives, so on, being worker owned, that kind of thing, that will meet with lots of resistance, and you can expect something on the lines of the Chicago Boys coming in and trying to stop it. So, something to think about. Anyone else?
So I this is just kind of like a personal background thing for me, but I work in civic tech and government tech and find cybernetics really interesting. And I really, really do like the idea of like worker cooperatives getting more involved in the government technology space, because there's just a lot of really, really crappy private companies doing a lot of bad stuff, and they're all very top down. But like, I think a worker cooperative would like have some valuable insight to actually like organizing the governmental technology stuff in ways that were not so, hierarchical, closed down, siloed off, and not very good. So.
Yeah. I've done a bunch of government contracts, I've bid on contracts, a long time ago, federal and some state, mostly federal. And my argument is that it's mostly strategic. It's well known that the quality that government pays for is lower than what commercial large entities pay for. So that procurement process, it's how does the corruption get in there? How does it happen? Well, at the higher end, the people who are very skilled government contractors, they'll eat your lunch when you go up against them and bid, because they have many, many angles. That's what you're up against when you are you could say the small guy or what have you. It's just easier to get commercial work, and less hoops to jump through, so on and so forth. And it's really at the point where it's almost like altruism when you do government stuff.
Yeah, the procurement process is like completely broken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That would be the thing to attack, is that procurement process.
So
yeah,
for me, I think that last quote of Beer, where he's talks about a smaller recursion, being impossible to succeed in, if the highest recursion is capitalistic. It's just sent me down this spiral of, oh man, like how, like, I believe that worker co-ops are really what socialism really means, and proliferating that to some extent is probably the best way to achieve some of the promises of socialism. But then you again, this book just took me through so many rabbit holes between how do you apply a viable system model to like actual processes, and I found a bunch of papers on how do you map a viable system model to a Scrum team, or it's a lot of different things, and was just wondering to what extent can an evolutionary take like Chile's can survive, especially in countries so entrenched with capitalism and individualism, such as the one we live in. Another sort of rabbit hole that I went down on was So at the end of the book, Medina makes again sort of a where are they now type of review, and so Fernando Flores, which was the guy that brought Stafford Beer to Chile to help him with his project. He ends up going to jail for a few years. Stafford Beer helps him get out of jail and get out of Chile. He ends up becoming this tech entrepreneur and a millionaire and whatever. And he ends up going back to Chile as a member of the right-wing party because now he believes basically the opposite of what he did in his youth. And Stafford Beer, which was originally a contractor living a very affluent lifestyle, ends up basically becoming a hippie, teaching yoga for free, and basically they switch places is the metaphor that she makes. And so one of the things that Fernando Flores talks about, or that she mentioned, is that he realizes that in the project, Cybersyn was sort of doomed to fail because he describes that the project might have been sound theoretically, but the reality of the dynamics of the country and the international pressures or whatever just didn't really allow him or the project to learn from what they were doing, and they were just always reacting to their reality. And he talks about speech act theory and a lot of other things that he developed later on. And so there's just so many things that I bought like 5 books after reading this book. Like some from Fernando Flores, some about cybernetics. So yeah, just at this point, I'm just rambling about how interesting this was.
So Jose, can you say, I picked up Designing Freedom. Anything else by Stafford? Because that was cheap. Some of them are really expensive.
So Jeff Susna recommends this one called The Cybernetic Brain, which I sort of perused it once I got it. And it's a collection of readings from everyone that talks about cybernetics, Stafford Beer included, but some of the other people. And so I got that one. And then, Fernando Flores talks about how conversations and speech act theory and promises versus requests versus statements are, the most important thing that he got out of the project. And Jeff Susna talks about promise theory a lot. So I got this book called Promise Theory, Principles and Applications, and Thinking in Promises, Designing Systems for Cooperation. I can send you the list. And then there's a collection of essays by Fernando Flores called Conversations for Action and Collected Essays. So yeah, it's just basically this guy is saying, cybernetics didn't do it for me. Thinking about human relationships and individualism is what is most important. And I think that sort of frames his transition into a right-wing person and, who he ended up becoming.
Yeah, I guess post that in the meetup group if you can, that list. And looks like we're at the hour here. Any final words?
For me, thank you guys for allowing me to drive the review today, and thanks everyone for joining and for choosing this book, which I thought was the most interesting thing that come out of the previous one. So yeah, looking forward to the next one.